Just to get you up to speed, we already introduced the webinar to all of our participants and said why we're here. So you are good to go with giving us a little bit of a background and how it all started. And yeah, and the slides are on. Everybody should see it on their screen, and you just let me know when to change them.
Okay, thank you so much. And let me start by apologizing to all of you for being late. I got stuck in GA street closures and they wouldn't let pedestrians through and so on. But I'm here now, and I'll begin by thanking Outright and RFSL and ILGA for putting this webinar together, and those that will follow this one. And also for all the very significant contributions that they've made in every phase to date in the development of the LGBTI Inclusion Index. So as Micah said, I've been asked to provide a summary of the background that led to and the approach proposed for the LGBTI Inclusion Index, as well as provide a bit of information about the first consultation we held to hear and learn from others and inform the thinking about this LGBTI inclusion initiative. And my apologies to those of you who are already familiar with these details, but it's great to also be able to engage with those of you who are just now coming into this process. So first slide, please, Micah. Okay, so let's go back a bit to why UNDP wanted to undertake consultations and engage in this work. So I'm going to start with some of the very depressing facts that you all know all too well. With 73 countries and territories criminalizing same-sex acts between consenting adults and more than 8 countries punishing such acts with a death sentence, 2.79 million people, or 38% of the world's population, still reside in places where being gay can lead to prison or death. People who express a gender identity that doesn't conform with their gender as assigned at birth also face punishment, and legal provisions and social orders based on cisgender norms and frequently lead to discrimination against both transgender and intersex people at many levels, and experiences of stigma, discrimination, and violence mark the lives of millions of LGBTI individuals. I could go on and on, but I think we all know the situation. And even where the climate isn't as hostile, LGBTI people continue to be excluded from many spheres of life, and it's still common to face exclusion and encounter barriers to accessing markets, services, and spaces. But despite the work that remains to be done, there is cause for some positiveness. You know, the years of engagement with the UN human rights system has begun to deliver really important results. However, there's a lot more that remains to be done. And in particular, I want to focus on the fact that most development work hasn't yet had significant, or in many cases, any focus on LGBTI people. So for the last few years, in a growing number of countries, UNDP has been working with governments, parliamentarians, members of the judiciary, academia, civil society, and other stakeholders through regional and national capacity building initiatives that support the inclusion of LGBTI people. Next slide, please, Micah. So why propose this new initiative? Well, we know that good data increases knowledge and awareness. It challenges denial and fosters more informed decisions, actions, and policy dialogue, ultimately with the objective of achieving positive changes in people's lives, particularly of the most marginalized, excluded, and vulnerable. Therefore, a long-standing aspect of UNDP's work has been to support national actors to collect and analyze the necessary data and evidence base that is required to inform national development plans, policies, and programs. And the more that we engaged in regional and country-level work with LGBTI people, the more we and others started to realize how important it was to try to scale up the work of the UN's development system to complement the work focused on the human rights system. The discussion of what kind of SDG support would be required was taking place as the content of the goals was being agreed and the indicators to measure them were starting to be debated. And it was becoming increasingly clear that to implement Agenda 2030, a range of resources and goods, solid data, and evidence-based research would be required to drive smart investment of these resources to achieve results. And along with a few LGBTI activists, many of whom are involved in this, organizations and supporters, a few people at UNDP realized that the SDGs could provide an important opportunity to bring some additional focus on the need to build national, regional, and global capacities to address data gaps on LGBTI people. And if the commitment that no one would be left behind was to be honored and achieved, the rights and inclusion of LGBTI people would have to be advanced. So we have a new platform. Next slide, please, Micah. However, we still face a particularly critical gap in the global data collection efforts that will drive the implementation of the SDGs, and this is the lack of data on LGBTI inclusion. We know that specific data on LGBTI populations is sparse, and where it does exist, it's rarely collected systematically, making it hard to track trends and develop analysis that can be applied to legal, policy, and program reforms. But there is mounting evidence that suggests that homophobia, transphobia, and other forms of stigma, violence, and discrimination, including on the basis of bodily diversity, significantly hinder social and economic progress, and therefore will have a direct impact on country and national level abilities to achieve the SDGs in the future. For example, a World Bank study highlighted the cost of homophobia and produced analysis that showed that homophobia could be costing India 32 billion in GDP losses. A study by USAID and the Williams Institute demonstrated the connections between LGBTI exclusion and per capita GDP. And the Global Index on Legal Recognition of Homosexual Orientation includes data collected from the 1960s onwards that reflects that one additional LGBTI-related right in a country's legal system equals a 3% increase in GDP per capita. These are very useful studies, of course, but there are many, many, many gaps, particularly for trans and intersex people. And also, much of the work to date doesn't yet fully define social inclusion of LGBTI people, nor do they completely address how to measure this concept. So in response to this lack of data and the related absence of measurement of inclusion of LGBTI people in the context of the SDGs, UNDP initiated these efforts to consult about the possibilities of developing a global mechanism to help fill these gaps that will inhibit countries in achieving the SDGs and continue to exclude LGBTI people. So to begin thinking about how to define the inclusion of LGBTI people in the development context, the starting point was to think about various definitions of human development and how it's measured. So the Human Development Index was created to move away from definitions of development that are only about economic growth. And instead, as the term suggests, human development puts people, their opportunities and choices at the center of development. The focus on opportunities is about giving people more freedom to live the lives they value. In effect, this means developing people's abilities and giving them a chance to use them. And you'll see the three foundations of human development, and these are the three gold-colored bars at the top right, are to live a long and healthy and creative life, to be knowledgeable, and to have access to resources needed for a decent standard of living. Of course, this is incomplete, and there are many other things that are important too, especially in helping to create the right conditions for human development. And I want to talk just for a second about choice. Human development is really about providing people with opportunities. And the process of development, human development at least, should be about creating an environment for people individually and collectively to develop their full potential and have a reasonable chance of leading productive and creative lives that they value. So this approach emphasizes that people and their capacities should be the ultimate criteria for assessing the development of a country, not just economic growth alone. So based on this flagship work of the Human Development Index and the related indices, we began thinking about if an LGBTI inclusion index could be a useful tool, among others, to inform evidence-based development strategies that help advance the inclusion of LGBTI people, achieve the SDGs, and truly leave no one behind. So last slide, please, Micah. Thanks. So in order to start the consultations on this idea, UNDP and OHCHR jointly convened a multi-sectoral expert meeting in September 2015. And this meeting brought together UN representatives, LGBTI rights advocates, data collection experts, and some key private sector leaders in data collection and analysis. Together, these experts considered how the inclusion of LGBTI people could be defined and what aspects of inclusion and development could be measured by a global index. Through the discussions, a working definition of LGBTI inclusion, was developed that, like the Human Development Index and other indices, also includes a focus on both access to opportunities and achievement of outcomes for LGBTI people. By the end of that meeting, the participating experts had reached consensus on 4 priority areas that they proposed should be the starting point for tracking progress on the inclusion of LGBTI people in development all around the world. And these were, first, economic well-being, and these are not ranked, they were all equally ranked. Second, political and civic participation. Third, personal safety and violence. And 4, health. There were also preliminary discussions about the kinds of indicators that could be identified or developed to measure the inclusion of LGBTI people in these 4 priority areas, recognizing that it would be necessary to specifically identify indicators to measure the issues specific or particularly relevant to different groups that fall under what we know is an imperfect and incomplete but a representative umbrella term, LGBTI. In other words, there would need to be specific consideration given about how to measure the inclusion of lesbians, of gay men, bisexual, transgender, and intersex people. By the end of that meeting, we also realized the importance of undertaking further consultation with LGBTI activists and organizations to provide additional feedback and inputs on the meeting results about the value of and approach to defining and measuring the inclusion of LGBTI people in a global index. So this is the background, and at this point, I will turn it over to Felicity, I think.
Thank you, Suki.
Thank you, Suki.
Yeah.
Thank you, Suki. Yeah, so I didn't introduce myself properly last time. I'm Felicity Daly. I'm the Global Research Coordinator for Outright Action International, and Outright and ILGA World helped take the index to the next step in 2015. And I'd like to introduce Renato Sabadini, the Executive Director of ILGA, to make some remarks about that part of the process.
Hi everybody, and thanks a lot, Felicity. This is Renato Sabadini from ILGA in Geneva. Indeed, we were elated in September 2015, and as Micah correctly remembered, that was the beginning of this process. We invited, together with other organizations, including Outright and RFSL, this first expert meeting in New York, organized by UNDP. And we were elated because there was a realization within UNDP that something needed to be done because LGBTI reference was completely excluded from the current SDGs. So after that meeting, what basically happened is that both ILGA and Outright worked on 2 different items. Basically, ILGA launched an online consultation on what dimension should an inclusion index feature, And this process was led at that point by Angus Carroll, who also began this at the beginning of this process here now, and unfortunately now, because of health reasons, cannot be here with us today. And 315, if I'm not mistaken, people and either individuals or organization replied to that consultation, and the results were then further analyzed in a report. And after that, and I think here Felicity will step back in, there was a validation meeting of the results in New York in the December of that year, hosted by Outright.
Yes, thank you, Renato. We had about 70 participants from all the global regions, and really focusing on meaningfully engaging civil society across our subpopulations. In the expert group meeting, civil society participation was limited, and we were very clear that we were underrepresented in, besides sexual orientation, in issues around gender identity and expression and diverse sex characteristics. So Outright ensured that there was a wider representative body to work together over a 2.5-day process in December 2015. And I think the meaningful thing to note here is that that meeting came up with the addition of the education dimension into the index, and that was agreed there. And it did some initial work on the illustrative indicators. So when you see an infographic about the indicators as they are now, you'll see 1 to 2 or maybe 3 bullet points under each dimension, which gave you a sense of what we were thinking about as we started to work through the dimensions at that time, what kind of indicators could be used for data collection. But it was a very nascent process, and it wasn't something that we had really thought about in terms of what we're doing now, which is really getting a set of indicators that we can all agree and that we can begin to use methodologically. So we're trying to put them right now under the sort of test of whether it will work or not for data collection. And that's where we go forward in the next couple of weeks. So I'm going to turn this back over to Micah now.
Thanks, Felicity. So like Felicity was saying, there was not that much time to dive into a very detailed work around indicators, because it was so important to get the dimensions and what we should be looking at, that we didn't really get into the nitty-gritty of proper indicators as such. But luckily we can pick it up now with this process that is starting officially today with the introductory webinar. And the process, the goal of the consultation right now is to provide the civil society input into the development of indicators to measure LGBTI inclusion, and also to arrive at convergence on indicators. And these indicators for all the 5 priority dimensions would be then used by UNDP and others as substance for populating the proposed LGBTI inclusion index. And what is important here to mention and to remember as we go along with the process is that it's not the end. It's just a start of trying to create a set of indicators which would later grow and be adapted to the needs that are at hand. And also another thing important is that there are different elements of the consultation, and civil society-led consultation and the process is just one component of a broader consultative process to get to the first set of indicators. And Suki will get back to that to tell you more about the other parts of the process. So what are the steps in those consultations? So as we mentioned, it's the webinar today. to bring everybody on up to speed. And then, as you could see from the invitation that was sent in the last couple of weeks, we will have a set of webinars, which will be a 90-minute long webinars focusing on each of the dimension. They will happen during 1 week in October, at the beginning of October. And we will work in thematic groups. You can sign up to whatever topic you are mostly passionate about and want to contribute to. And we will be working from a document, background document, reference material, however you want to call it, which is being prepared by our two colleagues, Lee Budget and Randy Sell. And they will propose a set of draft indicators to help us navigate and go deeper into the indicators. And this document will be shared with you at the end of the month. So then we can prepare properly for the thematic webinars. And Felicity already mentioned that she will tell you in a second a bit more about the criteria and how we're going to work with specific questions around those draft indicators. And after all those thematic or dimension webinars, as we call them, we will take all the inputs that we received from all of them. We will put the analysis and points into a report, which will be again worked on by Lee and Randy to define and feed into next steps of the consultations. And I think Suki can tell you now about the next steps of technical consultations to give you a fuller picture of what's coming after we have given our views and priorities and ideas around indicators from the civil society side. Suki?
Thanks, Micah. I just want to start by reiterating a point that you just made, which is that the set of indicators that is being developed to form the basis of this round of consultations is based on and comes from all the work that was done in the previous consultations. So this is not starting afresh. The draft set of indicators that are being developed for all of you to, give your opinions on and provide inputs on are really a continuation of the work that has already happened. So as you've heard, the aim of this exercise is to develop, consult, and seek several rounds of input to review and revise an initial set of measurable indicators for all 5 agreed priority areas of LGBTI inclusion. And as Micah said, this initial set of indicators can be used not only to operationalize the LGBTI Inclusion Index, but also in complementary research and data collection exercises. So what's the process? Today, together with the World Bank, we have agreed on a 3-step consultation process. As Micah said, the first step is this one, which is led by and for civil society participants. And you've heard already about how that process will go. The results of the consultations with civil society participants will then be provided to 5 small working groups of multi-sectoral experts, 1 for each of the 5 priority dimensions. These multi-sectoral expert groups will be quite small, about 7 to 10 representatives in each of the 5 groups, including experts in the agreed dimensions, and I can repeat those again: economic well-being, political and civic participation, which is broadly defined to also include anti-discrimination frameworks and legal recognition, personal safety and nonviolence, health and education. And these experts will come from multilateral organizations, civil society, academia, the private sector, foundations, and governments that are supporting LGBTI inclusion efforts. We're engaging in discussions with relevant UN agencies about the respective contributions that they can also potentially make, including by co-leading and contributing to the technical reviews of the draft indicators that will be undertaken through virtual consultations of the 5 small expert groups. And this is important both from a practical point of view, but also because we're working to ensure that this issue of advancing the inclusion of LGBTI people, including through this index, is something that's taken on by the UN system more broadly. The virtual consultations of the multi-sectoral expert groups will begin towards the end of October and will last about 3 weeks, and will be focused on providing technical inputs to the draft set of indicators relevant to the dimension that each is focused on. And they will also have, as Micah said, all the main outputs of the discussions from the civil society webinars. And all these inputs together will be used to refine and revise the draft set of indicators. The consultation process will culminate in mid-December of this year at a fairly small in-person consultation of participants from these first 2 phases of virtual consultations, who will then be able to provide final inputs to and confirm the agreed indicators proposed for the initial operationalization of the LGBTI Inclusion Index. So by the end of this year, we will have an initial set of core indicators developed covering all 5 dimensions. I also wanted to say that while this phase of indicator development will certainly include some consideration of data collection methodologies, a more robust review of those methodologies that will be most relevant and appropriate for the index will follow at the beginning of next year once we have an agreement on the draft set of indicators. And of course, we will continue efforts to mobilize the resources required to operationalize the LGBTI Inclusion Index and support national governments and civil society and other stakeholders to make the promise of inclusion a reality for LGBTI people. So that's the process.
Thank you, Suki, for that. Felicity, would you like to go and tell us about the criteria that we will be working on?
I would love to. Yes, and you're going to bring up it's a very short and simple slide set that I can share with everybody to basically ask you to contribute to the Dimension webinars and the sort of thinking we want to bring constructively to that process. When you have the set of proposed indicators with you, you're going to be asking of yourself some key questions about those indicators. And we've broken them down into about 6 or 7 questions, which I'll go through now. So firstly, and these will be circulated when the background paper with the proposed set of indicators is circulated. And we will be taking you through these when we each co-convene the Dimension webinars. So firstly, are the indicators being proposed going to help track and compare LGBTI inclusion across different countries? And a sub-question to that is, will it help track changes over time and changes within countries? The second most kind of crucial question, is whether the indicator is relevant and available for a wide range of countries. Are there pertinent issues and concerns regarding data collection related to or required by any of the proposed indicators? And thirdly, would the use of any indicator necessitate the generation of new data, e.g. working with government agencies on survey mechanisms or other methods? Any feedback about the options, opportunities, and challenges related to data collection for any of the indicators? Next slide, Micah. Do You have technical input on the construction of the draft indicators. We welcome suggestions about the drafting, how they're written, of any of the proposed indicators, and an explanation of any of the technical changes being proposed. Or is there any additional specific feedback on indicators that you want to provide, including about the methodological concerns and additional feedback that civil society wants to ensure is provided to the next stage of the process, which Suki has outlined. And I think these are also two key questions which we've broken down into sub-questions. Are there any key gaps? This virtual consultation with civil society is really designed to identify any gaps in the proposed indicators that appear in the consultant's reference document, particularly those that have an impact on developing or prioritizing specific indicators in the draft set. Keeping in mind the focus is on the indicators rather than any of the narrative that explains why they've been selected. And very importantly, as we said before, full representation of LGBTI people means that we want to ensure that the indicators do not exclude any LGBTI populations or subgroups. A very important part of the feedback is whether there are gaps regarding how lesbian or gay or bisexual or trans or intersex people have been accounted for in the draft set of indicators for any of the 5 dimensions. And we have really looking in this process of coming to convergence, but the last thing to keep in mind, Micah's last slide here, is a question of what indicators would you suggest be prioritized for each dimension? So an important aspect of the civil society consultation is to inform about how to prioritize the proposed indicators for each dimension. Understanding it'll be difficult, choices will have to be made around the number of indicators that can be operationalized at this time and for the index overall. And a general guideline that we are basically putting out there is we will expect that there will be under 10 indicators proposed for each dimension at this initial stage. So again, this set of criteria will be sent out with the proposed set of indicators, and we will be going through this point by point in those dimension webinars. Thanks, Micah.
Thank you, Felicity. So I think this is all that we wanted to share with you when it comes to sharing information and where we are and what is coming up. We have some time for questions and answers if there are any. And how it will practically happen is that if someone wants to ask a question and speaks English, they can do it with a audio, and our colleagues who use Spanish or French can type in the chat box, and our colleagues interpreting, they can help us with that. That I think will be the smoothest way of doing that. Are there any questions? And if you do have a question and you want to use the audio, yeah, unmute yourself. Thank you.
Hello. May I go ahead?
Yes, please.
My name is Emmanuel. I have a quick question on can someone be part of 2 groups like on health and political and civic participation? Over.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Absolutely. You can sign up to any number of webinars. They are on different days. So you can just choose which you are mostly interested in and just send us an email and we will sign you on and share information and call in details.
Hi, hello, it's Andrea. Can I go ahead?
Absolutely.
Yes. Hi, morning, afternoon. I just have a quick question because here in El Salvador, I overheard that UNDP is doing a personal consultation with few LGBTIQ activists, I mean in person. I don't know, is that a practice that all UNDP's offices around the world it's gonna have, or how we can participate? Because I thought that the only way that social the civil society can get involved in this process is through these webinars. But I would like to know if you know there is another way to participate.
Shall I answer that?
Please do.
Now?
Mhm.
Okay, so thank you very much for the question. Some country offices, and I think El Salvador is one of the first ones, are thinking about ways to use the index process to inform their work at the national basis. So to work with civil society organizations nationally and locally to discuss the dimensions, to discuss the indicators, and to think about all of that in their national contexts. Because in every country, the way in which the SDGs work and the way in which, to some extent, this index will work is there will need to be some consideration about how the context is taken into account in doing the data collection, in framing the questions, in collecting and analyzing, and so on. So the consultation that you're referring to is not formally part of this process, but it is complementary to and will be used within the national context for framing efforts and forging partnerships that will be part of the ways in which we operationalize the index. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you, Suki. I just want to know how we can get involved then in that consultations too, because I mean, for example, in El Salvador, they just invited 2 people to the consultation. So I don't know if how to get involved in this like one-to-one consultation.
Can I ask that you, maybe if you send me an email bilaterally, I can follow up with my colleagues there and get you in touch with them, because I don't, I'm not involved in their own process. And maybe I can also say that we have a range of country offices, in fact, a growing number of them, that are doing different forms of work to advance the rights and inclusion of LGBTI people. You know, we have regional projects that involve national implementation in 3 regions at the moment. And it's possible that part of the consultations that some of the country offices are doing are not directly about the index, but they're thinking about how they're going to try to bring some of the learning information and frameworks into the other work that they're doing that's related, but not formally part of this. But if you write to me separately, I will get in contact with and put you in contact with the relevant UNDP people in El Salvador. And the same for anyone else. If they've heard about consultations, just let me know and I will make contact for you with our country offices.
Thank you.
Thank you, Suki. Now we have 3 questions in the chat box. Could we ask for translation? The first one is from Francisco.
Sorry, Micah, are you hearing a translation from someone?
No.
For the chat box questions? I can do it. The first one is they're asking how that we can get the PowerPoint that you used in the presentation, if we can get it.
In Spanish.
Yes, in Spanish. Francisco is asking in Spanish, yes.
Yes. And this is the interpreter. I'm going to read the questions. Sorry, I was having a little bit of technical difficulty here. Genesis is asking from Mexico regarding the seminars. She already read that. Regarding the seminars, he had already registered for all of them, or for the ones that he wanted to do. Does he have to do it again? That's Genesis' question.
So the PowerPoint, just to answer the two at the same time. The PowerPoint presentation we can share.
En cuanto a la presentación.
And the second question, if you have registered already, it's recorded in our system, so you don't have to do it again. And
I think it's a question for Suki whether or not the PowerPoint can be translated into Spanish, or if there is a Spanish version of the infographic available at least.
Sí, habría que preguntarle a Suki si hay una traducción de esto. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Still?
I can.
Okay, thank you so much. From Colombia, Vivian Cuello is telling us they had problems with the sound throughout the seminar. So they would like to know where can they see or get the information, all the material in detail again. And Vivian is telling us that they can't hear still. And Carolina is telling us that she does hear the translation, and Genesis for some reason stopped listening. She can no longer hear, hearing the audio.
About access to the information from the webinar, everything is recorded, so we can share that file with everybody. And there were some questions before the webinar already from people who cannot participate today because of other engagements. So we are happy to share that with everyone.
Should I answer the question about the PowerPoint?
Mm-hmm.
So we have the full infographic available in Spanish, and I don't yet have the PowerPoint, but we should be able to produce one fairly shortly that we can circulate.
Thank you, Suki. There's one question from Ryan. Ryan, would you like to say it? It's fine if you use audio. Ryan, can you hear us? You're on mute. Can you unmute yourself? Oh, the mic is not working. I will read out loud the question that Ryan typed. Many LGBTIQ groups are working around influencing human rights mechanisms. Some generated good outcomes, such as references to SOGIESC in concluding observations and UPR recommendations. How would these outcome documents from human rights mechanisms feed into the development of indicators?
Shall I take a first stab at answering that? Okay, so thanks, Ryan, for the question. So there are a number of ways in which there's lots of cross-fertilization between the outcomes from human rights focused mechanisms and this. And from a starting point, I will just reassure everyone that the approach that UNDP and the entire UN development system takes to development is a human rights-based one. So it's informed by norms and standards, and it is framed around the building of capacities of rights holders and duty bearers to claim those rights. So that's true in the context of this work to advance the rights and inclusion of LGBTI people too. In the development of some of the previous background materials that have informed our consultation and up till this point, and indeed at this stage as well as we're preparing indicators, we and our consultants and experts are all going to be looking at all the various forms of indicators that exist that are relevant to each of the 5-dimension areas and the specific aspects of them that we want to be able to measure via the indicators. So there will be many ways and in different forms that human rights outcomes, human rights mechanisms will be informing the way in which we think about and frame the indicators. And at this stage, I can't give you a more specific answer than that because we're still working on the indicators themselves. But rest assured, this is, as all of our work is, based in a human rights-based approach to development.
Thank you, Suki. Are there any other questions? The chat box is empty for now.
Yeah, could I ask a question?
Absolutely, please go ahead.
Hello, my name is Pedro. I speak from Brazil, representing the organization TODES. First, I would like to thank you all for this presentation. It was a lot clarifying regarding the issue. I would also like to thank you for being able to share the presentations with us. I intend to share this knowledge with the other people that work with me in the organization. I would just ask, if possible, to once more for you to talk about the last step of the consultation, because this was not really clear to me, the step that will be held during December. And as well, one more request. How could we contact you through which email to maybe solve future questions that appear?
Shall I start by answering the question again about the final phase of the consultations in this round?
Yes, please.
So thank you very much, Pedro, for the question. So we've sequenced the different aspects of consultations in such a way that the civil society ones are first, because we wanted this to form the basis of everything that comes afterwards. So we wanted to ensure that we had the thinking, the inputs, the additions, the objections, if there are, from civil society participants at the beginning, so that these could be taken into account by the 5 small groups of multi-sectoral experts that will then work on providing technical inputs to analyze and potentially revise the draft set of indicators. So each of those 5 groups of multi-sectoral experts will work on their specific set of indicators. After that process, the inputs that have come out of and the contributions of both sets of virtual consultations, so these ones with all of you, and then the ones with the multi-sectoral expert groups, which will also include some civil society participants, will culminate in the final meeting that you were asking about. So this will be a fairly small meeting, and it will be constituted by participants from these first 2 rounds of consultations. And they will be looking at the revised set of indicators that will be produced. And this is going to be an iterative process throughout, where we will continue to be revising the indicators to improve them, to strengthen them, to take into account the feedback that we're getting from all parts of this consultation process. So, you know, in the end, the group that will convene in person will have the job of looking at the revisions that have been made, discussing whether or not anything further is required in order either to fully reflect the feedback that we've had or to deal with any remaining technical issues. And then at the end of that process, what we will have is the set of indicators that are agreed as the initial set to take forward the operationalization of the index, but that can also be used for all kinds of complementary research and data collection. Is that clear? Does that answer your question about that final in-person meeting?
Yeah, it does. Thank you very much, Suki. It was very clarifying.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we had two questions in French, in Spanish. One is from Francisco, and then one is from Genesis in the chat box.
Can you hear me there?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. So Francisco is asking, why have you not considered the labor aspect as an indicator? That is one. Genesis is just letting us know that she had to leave the meeting, but she would be sending any questions to the group.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. And you have the question by Francisco about the labor aspect. Okay.
Thank you. Suki, do you want to try the labor?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Let me simply say that we don't have the draft set of indicators for any of the dimensions yet, but in the economic well-being dimension, if you look at the infographic, you'll see that among the iterative examples that are there are things like income disparities and poverty levels of LGBTI people, the existence of employment non-discrimination laws and their implementation, and these are just a couple of them. We aren't yet able to say what will be included in the full set of draft indicators for this dimension and indeed for the others. So I would say stay tuned. And when the draft is out, we are very much looking forward to feedback exactly of that kind for us to debate and discuss.
Thanks, Suki. We are soon running out of time, so maybe one or two questions more if there are any, and then we will close the call. Is there anything else people are wondering?
Maybe because we have a few minutes, may I ask a last question? My name is Emmanuel again, and I'm sorry to come again and again. I just want to hear about if there is any effort to call on this kind of introductory call, or in the future, in the 4 or 5 thematic, to have some representatives from Africa continent. I'm saying this because when we have those 5 or 4, I don't remember, big thematic, we need to have a voice from the continent. And I was trying to go through the name of participant, and I would like to recommend, if this is possible, to make an effort to have a voice to contribute to the thematic. Thank you. Over.
Can I just come in, Micah, and answer 2 things? One is, we did have a question regarding whether or not people wanted to ask anything and contact anyone, and they can continue to do that on the indicators@rfsl.se email, which all the co-conveners can check, and we can confer amongst ourselves if there's a question there that needs clarification. And then in regards to participation from regions, we have been going very thoroughly through a variety of contacting mechanisms, which includes all the entire ILGA World membership. It It is a series of listservs that individuals involved in SOGIASC movements are signed up to, and individually back to those who participated in the face-to-face consultations in December 2015 that were convened, which we discussed earlier. Participation is voluntary. If people feel that there are colleagues that they are not sure are aware of the opportunity, please do share this. It's on the social media platforms of both Outright, ILGA, and RFSL. So there are quick little messages and memes that can be shared amongst yourselves. We absolutely want to build participation. We are worked very thoroughly through the time zones as well to ensure that we are able to have times that most people can participate in across multiple regions. Of course, this does become difficult, but we have done our best to try to do that. And Micah, I don't know if we wanted to say one last thing, which is included in the invitation about submission of written statements.
I beg my pardon. Can I intervene for a second? Hello?
Yeah, please.
Can you hear me?
Go ahead.
Yeah, my name is Pat. I come from Ecom. I made a special effort to be on this webinar, but as it stands, I missed it. Like, you started an hour ago, or what?
There was a little bit of problem with,
because GMT plus GMT 1 o'clock is now. It's like 1:14 by GMT, and as you were speaking about the time zones, this is why I thought it was maybe appropriate, because I'm not in my home time zone right now, and I calculated it, and 1 GMT 1 o'clock is right now. I'm sorry, and I missed the call. Can I have some material or outcomes of it somewhere?
Yes, and you are right. There was a problem with our time zone calculation, so we apologize for that. Everything is recorded, and we will share the information and material.
Oh, okay, perfect.
And we can assure you that the webinars are correctly converted and calculated a couple of times, and we checked to avoid the situation from today. So we apologize for the mix-up.
Yes, and one more question: when you will do it? Because I need to report back to my organization. We need to take preparations for the upcoming occasions.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So when approximately will you circulate the recording?
I will process it as soon as possible.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you so much.
No problem.
And this is Søren Laursen speaking. I had the same problem. I just got on at this wrong hour.
Hello, can I have one more question?
Please, go ahead.
Hello, my name is Romina. I just wanted to ask about, thank you for doing this. I wanted to ask, I would like to be in contact with our country UNDP office about this. Do you know how much of a priority would it be for the local offices to work on this issue?
Thank you. Let me start by answering that question first, and then I want to go back to the previous question on representation. So thank you very much for the question about priorities. Let me say this: the priorities of every country office are set nationally, and they are set through the consultations that are held with government, with civil society, with the range of development partners in every country. These are reflected and agreed in the country program document, and then are implemented through a series of activities. So the reason I'm going through this long bureaucratic answer is that the priorities are adjusted in accordance with demand and in consultation with all the stakeholders. So government, civil society, the range of stakeholders. So if you are not sure, and you know, these things are not driven from headquarters. It's really nationally driven priorities that are reflected in the work that a country office takes on. Of course, our hope is that the index will help generate interest and provide some tools and be a catalyst for the building of capacities of the range of stakeholders to engage in exactly the kind of data collection that we're talking about, and then to also be able to take any data that is available or that is generated and analyze it and apply it to policy, program, budget, and so on. So my response to your question is, this is exactly the sort of thing that it is great for civil society to engage with country offices on, to ask them about the ways in which they might be able to take this forward, to strengthen partnerships that exist and to forge some new ones. And just to come full circle, this is really the opportunity that the SDGs present, because we have a whole new framework for engaging on issues because of the Leave No One Behind commitment that may not have been on the radar of a range of country offices, and that there is now a new opening to try to expand the space for exactly this kind of work. Because the index is not the end goal, it's a means, it's an advocacy tool, and it's a capacity building exercise that's meant to help advance rights and inclusion across countries. Now, can I go back just for a second to the representation question? And I just want to thank you for raising this question and to reiterate how important it is to all of us who are involved in this to try to have participation from civil society in as many different countries and as many different contexts as possible, because it's through your participation that we will be able to really think about, are these indicators relevant for your context? Are they going to be able to be measured? Is the way in which we're thinking about constructing how to measure something, does this work in your context? So I just want to really thank you for asking that question and encourage all of you to engage within your own networks to have as robust a participation as possible in the webinars that will review the draft indicators for each of the 5 dimensions. So thank you for both questions.
Felicity?
Yes.
Yes. Did you want to talk about the submissions?
Yeah, so we have covered in the invitation that individuals can request that they would like to write in if they are unable to make the dimension calls. And we can recirculate that information with instructions for how to format the written submissions. And we have a number of questions about people wanting to stay on this call if we're basically able to finish now. And there are a number of people who have joined very recently who would like a quick resume of what we've covered today. I believe that we have the translation until for 10 more minutes. Is that correct?
Jeremy is checking how much time we have. So give us a couple of minutes.
And can we, because it was coming from me, can we ask maybe those who needed translations, they already were there and we don't need the translation, or it's something substantial, but just for me to know what happened before I listen to the video or watch the video, just like 5 minutes debrief, what you have talked about and what's next, so that we know, okay? Like something like very brief.
Sure, sure.
Please.
I think we can sort that. Absolutely. I think we can sort that now.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
If we have no further questions then from those who've been participating now for the last hour and 20 minutes. Would people like to stay on the call only if they want a summary session? And otherwise, we thank everyone very, very much for their participation. And we look forward very much to seeing you sharing the opportunities to join the webinars, and for you to join the webinars and to participate in any way that you can. So I see people saying farewell now. Okay, we'll just wait for most folks to drop off, and then we can definitely cover about, a 5 to 10 minute summary call.
And just to clarify about the interpretation, Jeremy came back, and basically we have 8 more minutes with our colleague.
Okay. It's not clear how many people will still need to go through that. Why don't I then start with a summary of what we've covered so far today. So what we have done is we've looked at the fact that we've had an LGBTI inclusion index existing now since the end of 2015. And our colleague Suki Beavers from UNDP went into background about why the UNDP has started this initiative and how it was framed. And Micah could probably pull up the very last slide of that presentation so we can see what the index looks like as a concept at this point. So the index has 5 key dimensions, which are trying to measure LGBTI inclusion in the aspects of economic well-being, political and civic participation, education, health, personal security, and violence. The work that was done in 2015 was consulted on by civil society. Outright and ILGA were involved in convening a civil society consultation on the index. And the indicators that you see when you look at this inclusion index now were iterative and sort of exemplary, basically. What we're going to do now in 2017 is to review the materials that have gone into building this index so far and get into a much more in-depth discussion of indicators under each dimension. So today's webinar was a general introduction to the concept and to let people know about the consultation opportunity that is occurring mainly the week of October 2nd through 6th, where we will hold 5 separate 90-minute consultations on each of these dimensions. And we will be focusing on a set of proposed indicators that are going to be developed by consultants employed by UNDP who are very expert in the field. And they will be putting out a proposed set of indicators based on their review of the documentation so far and the kinds of indicators that are widely used across the world in measuring issues like education, health, personal security and violence, economic well-being, and political and civic participation. So once those proposed set of indicators are available, we will be sending them out to everyone who's interested in joining the webinars. And with that, we are going to send out a set of criteria for reviewing the indicators. And the set of criteria really look at mainly a couple of key areas, which we reviewed on the call, and I will just briefly discuss now. So they're sort of trying to identify if the indicators are going to help us track and compare inclusion across different countries, if they're relevant and available for a wide range of countries, and will they require new data generation, and are they specific feedback on how the indicators have been drafted? Are there any key gaps? And particularly, can we ensure a way for the indicators to be inclusive of LGBTI populations and subgroups, all LGBTI people? And we will be obviously making some hard choices. There'll be on less than 10 indicators proposed for each dimension. And so we may be looking at issues of how to prioritize this. So the criteria will be circulated with a proposed set of indicators, and on the webinar calls on the 2nd and through the 6th of October, the schedule is available already. So on the 2nd, we have the health webinar, the 3rd, the education webinar, Wednesday the 4th, the political and civic participation webinar, Thursday the 5th, economic well-being, and Friday the 6th, personal security and violence. Those 90-minute webinars will be really looking at what the proposed set of indicators are and reflecting on this criteria. So everyone's asked to sign up. You can sign up for one or more, and you can go through the process on that call. And then the outcomes of those discussions will be presented back to UNDP to take them forward in their next 2 phases, which include a multi-sectoral data experts consultation that happens in mid-October. And then there'll be a final meeting to agree the initial set of indicators to finalize the LGBTI inclusion index as a concept. And we will start to begin to see this initiative take flight in 2018. So that is a very quick review of everything we covered on this call. Are there any key questions? We have about 2 minutes remaining.
Yes, can I go? Yeah,
please.
with a question. So could you please give a few examples how can organizations like working like ourselves on the regional level or at a very national level can instrumentalize the outcomes of this index in their advocacy contexts? Just a couple of examples if you have like some best practice from 2015.
Suki, are you still on the call with us?
Sorry, yes, I am. I was just typing an answer in the chat box.
Oh, I saw that. Yes, thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you for answering all these questions. Okay.
So at this stage, the process as we have laid it out in the webinar today, that is comprised of those 3 steps or those 3 sets of consultations are the process that will inform the development of the indicators that will be used to populate the index. So this is the extent of the consultations, the global consultations this year. But as a number of the participants have flagged, they're very interested in trying to find different opportunities for working with UNDP country offices to engage in this process and to use this opportunity to try to work on advancing the rights and inclusion of LGBTI people. And those kinds of country office engagements can take place, and we would be thrilled to have many of them take place, to think about how to operationalize the index in specific countries and then use the data and the analysis of it that comes from those consultations. Does that answer your question?
I'll just say, I think we, hopefully it does, and that if you have...
Yes and no, because I was more interested, like when we are collecting or asking our partners in the countries to collect the information of, for instance, violation of right to health or something like that, we know that we can use it as helping a person out personally, or maybe representing somewhere in the court, or using this data to generalize it and submit to special treaty bodies for the shadow reports or something else. So we know like where this data kind of ends. This is kind of the argument for the local organizations to engage and to invest their time in this, so that they can use it in the future for solving their very everyday problems. And advocacy asks, you know, like, what would be, where would they be able to publicize this data or use it somehow for advocacy?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so could I thank you for the clarification? Could I give a follow-up response? So let me explain that there are two overall streams of data that the LGBTI Inclusion Index will measure. The first is taking data that already exists from a range of different sources and pulling that together and aggregating it nationally and globally so that we have a big picture of what's happening. So included in that can be indicators that reflect exactly the sorts of things that you're talking about. So if you look, for example, at the infographic of the index, if you look under the personal security and violence dimension, you'll see the first of the indicative indicators is rates of violence against LGBTI people, including homicides. So that data would actually be taken from sources that often already exist. And those are the kinds of sources that you've referred to. So that can be things like reporting that's done through various human rights mechanisms. It can be through administrative data that is collected by the Justice Department. It can be through complaints that are received by a national human rights institution that has a mandate on non-discrimination that includes LGBTI people. So there can be a whole range of different sources that exist that we will look to gather different aspects of data on that feed into the different indicators in each of the dimensions. The second stream of data collection that we anticipate doing as part of the index is it involves doing new research and gathering data that doesn't yet exist. This will, of course, be the harder data to get at, and we will probably need time to work up to gathering, developing those kinds of indicators and then operationalizing them. But exactly the kinds of things you're talking about, these are the types of sources of data that already exist that would be very relevant for any number of potential indicators under all 5 of the dimensions. Does that better answer your question?
Yes, and one more if I can. How can we use this data was more of a question. Like, do we approach the country offices of UNDP, or do we get some kind of political support from UNDP when advocating with our own authorities based on this data? Like, is this data what I mean, for instance, for the shadow reporting, the countries are obliged to report on certain thing towards certain treaty body, and civil society is given a chance to present alternative data there. And this process is tied to the country's commitment to report on something, certain issue. And the commitment of certain committees who are created for the treaties and other things, who are there to oversee the adherence to these commitments. And this is the instrument where we instrumentalize this data. And what would be the best occasion to present and use this data for advocacy purposes? Like, would it be like something like AIDS 2018 or somewhere else? Or would it be more like conferences about LGBT issues? Or I ask mostly as the practice showed from the last time, where did people to take this data to? And sorry for being a pain with this question.
No, you're not a pain, Pata, at all. I do need to stress that we are beyond time with the translators in particular, which means we're going to run into some technical trouble. I would really invite you to write into the indicators at rfsl.se. I would also invite you to be thinking about this because you're really getting into the next stage of what will happen when the index is operationalized. And this part of the process is really to finalize the index as a concept. So it's wonderful that you're thinking about how it can be utilized as a mechanism once we have data collected. But this consultation is really focusing on setting those indicators. So I really invite everyone who remains, sign up for 1, 2, or as many webinars as you would like. Take yourself through the proposed set of indicators and the criteria. Join us in the first week of October, and be thinking about these next steps of how this can be utilized, but really mainly focus on the 6 criteria we've set out, which are really helping to shape the indicators that can be used in a multi-country context. So I think we're going to thank you all so much for your patience, particularly those who joined us late. And we're going to then bring this meeting to a close now. Micah, do you have any final things to say? And Suki, thank you very, very much.
I think that's it. I think, yeah, we covered a lot, and I'm really happy that so many joined. And like I said, or like it was said before a couple of times, please be in touch with us over email, and then look out for all the details about the webinars. We will be sharing links to connect to GoToMeeting again for specific sessions, and it will not be an open public information. So if you want to be part of the webinars, please send an email to the indicators@rfsl.se to get all the information. And thank you, Felicity and Suki, for preparing and being in the webinar.
Thank you so much, Micah. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.